Hi students, welcome to semester 2 and welcome to unit 3 ecosystems. In the first bend, we're going to be looking at some of the species on the Serengeti Plains, which is a grassland in Africa. So let's do a little bit of review of the levels of organization of an ecosystem. So we have, starting at, I'm actually going to go back a little bit. So in first semester, we focused on cell up to organism. So in first semester, as we talked about evolution and we talked about genetics, we looked at changes and traits. We looked at cells and tissues and physical structure within individual organisms. And we started with cells, right? We talked about individual cells and how cells that perform that of similar structure create tissues that work together to perform a job are organs. Those organs work together in organ systems, right? We talk about muscles, right? Each muscle is made up of different tissues, which are made of muscle cells. And those muscles work together to create the muscular system. And that muscular system is part of all the other organ systems that create the organism. So we have, up to this point, really focused on organism level biology. As we go into ecosystems, we're going to be looking more into population, which we did during evolution, but we're going to focus more on population. We're going to spend a lot of time talking about community level, where we're looking at the interactions of different populations of the same species, different organism populations interacting with one another. And we're going to be then adding in non-living factors like climate, temperature, precipitation, sunlight, soil, and we're going to put that together to talk about ecosystem level ecology. And when we start taking all of these ecosystems with similar characteristics and grouping those together and giving them broad names, for example, tropical rainforests, we take all those areas around the world that have those similar temperatures and precipitation and characteristics, we call those biomes. What we're really going to start out with semester 3 is we're going to be focusing on population and community level ecology. So today's lesson is what explains why the population of buffaloes in the Serengeti changes so much? Well, what are we talking about? What population of buffaloes and what kind of changes? So let's dive into the lesson. At the beginning of the lesson, we were asked to recall prior knowledge. What are some things that we know? And I'm going to change this question a little bit. I don't want to talk about what do we know about Africa. Africa is a continent, and it's just as diverse in its ecosystems as North America, as Asia, as Europe. And so I want to focus on what do we know about African grasslands? What do we know about the animals that live there, and what about the landscape? Now, we're going to be focusing on, for the purpose of this bend, we're going to be focusing on Serengeti. So Serengeti is a large grassland, and we're going to be looking at this area over here, which is over here in southeastern Africa, in the country of Tanzania. So we're going to look at this original data. So scientists did some research, and they did some studying of buffalo populations in the 60s and 70s, around the time when environmental research was really taking off. It was really at the forefront of what was going on in science. And so we have this data. And in your lesson, you were asked to analyze and describe patterns. Whenever I look at a graph, I recognize that a graph is a story. It is a story represented in numbers and in a visual pattern. Every good story has a beginning, middle, and end. And so when I'm asked to analyze data or to describe patterns, I'm going to give my story a beginning, middle, and end. In the beginning of our story, I would say in 1961, the buffalo population was about 30,000. From 1961 to 1975, the population increased. Now, I'm going to describe the way it increased. In this case, it kind of increased in a very much like a straight line, so I'm going to say it increased steadily or consistently over that time period. In 1975, it reached a population around 78,000. So I have a beginning, middle, and end. I could add some, of course, every good storyteller is going to add some details. So I could say that, in this time period, in this 14-year time period, that was a total increase of about 48,000 buffalo, which, as every good scientist knows, always leads to the question of, well, why did that happen? How do you go from 30,000 to 78,000 in that many years? What's going on? And so we're going to, as scientists, create some initial models, right? Take our thinking that's in our brain of what could be some of the reasons and putting it down, recording it down, and creating a model to be able to visually represent to others what we think is going on. In order to do that, this model needs to have buffalo, of course, right? And buffalo populations. Needs to include some ecosystem features found on the Serengeti. And the Serengeti is a grassland. So think about what types of things would you find on a grassland. And again, ecosystem means living and non-living. So things that are living organisms, but also some non-living organisms. And then the whys. Why would the buffalo numbers increase? And of course, you want to include arrows. You want to include labels in your model to make your model very clear to others. As we drew some models, we get some really good ideas of some initial thoughts of why the buffalo population may be increasing. Now, I'm not going to give away the thoughts of the classmates because I want you, if you happen to be doing this lesson for the first time, I want you to be thinking about and coming up with some ideas of your own. So we then dived into the idea of clarifying models. And so these are some questions that you can look at your model and say, hey, here's this model. What does this part of your model mean? Right? What are some evidence that you used? Can you tell me more about your model with a partner? But you can do this on your own as well. Okay, if I had to tell somebody about my model, what would I tell them? What could I add to this? Did I include everything that I need to include in my model? And the last one, does my model make sense, right? Do I agree with what I've put on paper? Does my model represent what I'm thinking? In class, we compared some similarities and differences in our models. Things that we noticed was that we came up with many different explanations for why the population increased. Some other things that we noticed as far as differences were the visual way that things were represented. Some people did them like a comic strip with a beginning, middle, and end. Some created a more visual model, like a landscape, right, incorporating different pieces. And one of the reasons there's so many differences is humans are so unique. Our brains are so unique, and there are lots of different ways to visually represent information. And we all think of information in different kind of ways and draw different pictures in our brain. And that's perfectly fine. It's part of the reason humans are so cool. We're going to brainstorming. The last thing we did is I asked everybody to brainstorm some questions. What are some questions that we could ask about the changing in the population? And some prompts that I asked you guys to think about were, what about before the data, right? Our data is a very narrow window for a population that of buffalo that still exists today in 2023 and existed well before 1960. So what are some questions that we might have about outside of that window of data we have? What are some questions we might ask about the data itself? What about the ecosystem of the Serengeti? Our data was about buffaloes, but could we think about that data and could we think about those populations of buffalo along with other organisms? So many ways and so many places that our questions could go. So as you're thinking of questions, want to be thinking all sorts of different ideas. And as we explore, we're going to be looking at these different interactions. And that's it for day 1.